The unexpected encounter. The dark, cold expanse of space stretched endlessly in all directions. Stars twinkled like distant, unreachable dreams. The small, rocky planet below was quiet, but it hadn't always been. Once it had been a thriving colony, full of life. But now it was nothing more than a graveyard. The war had wiped everything out. Buildings lay in ruins, smoke still rising from the wreckage. The once beautiful world had become a place of sorrow and death. Among the wreckage, a single small house stood alone, almost untouched by the chaos. Inside, a woman sat on the floor, surrounded by her 2 children. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with worry and fear. Her name was Lyra, a widow who had lost everything. Her husband, the love of her life, had died in the war. She had been left alone to care for their 2 young children, but now even that seemed impossible. Lyra held her children close, trying to comfort them, but her heart was heavy. The planet was falling apart, and there was no one left to help them. The last few months had been a nightmare. Food was scarce, the water supply had been poisoned in the fighting. And now, the shelter that had kept them safe was crumbling around them. She couldn't protect them anymore. She couldn't keep them alive much longer. There was only one chance, one slim chance to survive. Lyra had heard stories from the other survivors about the humans, strange, tough creatures who lived far away on their own planet, Earth. They were known for their strength, their will to survive, and their bravery. Many believed the humans wouldn't help. After all, they were just one family on a dying world. But Lyra knew she had to try. With shaking hands, Lyra activated the old communication device she had found in the wreckage. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She typed a simple message, her fingers trembling over the keys. It was a plea for help. "Please, help us. We are survivors. We need aid. My children are starving. My home is falling apart. If you can hear this message, please, help us." She pressed send and waited. Time seemed to stretch on forever as she stared at the device, her breath coming in short gasps. Nothing. No response. Her heart sank. She had hoped, but now it seemed that hope was foolish. But then, as she was about to give up, the device beeped. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. A voice came through the static, clear but cold. "This is Captain Jonas Cade, Earth Federation Military. I'm receiving your distress signal. Sit tight. Help is on the way." Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, not sure if she had heard it right. Help. The humans were coming to help her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. She had to stay strong. For her children. They couldn't see her break down. She had to believe that help was really coming. "Thank you," she whispered, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Thank you." But even as she whispered the words, doubt began to creep in. The humans were far away. What if they didn't make it in time? What if the planet fell apart before they could get there? What if they changed their mind or something went wrong? The wind howled outside, sending dust and debris crashing against the walls of their shelter. The roof creaked under the pressure. Lyra grabbed her children, pulling them close to her, trying to shield them from the storm. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure herself. "Help is on the way." Meanwhile, on a spaceship far above the planet, Captain Jonas Cade looked out the window. His ship was small, just a single transport vessel, but it was fast. He had received a distress signal before, but none like this. His mission was simple: investigate the signal, offer help if possible, and return to base. He had done this many times before. But something about this message, something about the way the woman had spoken, her desperate plea for help, tugged at his heart. He had seen war. He had seen destruction. He had fought in battles that left entire worlds in ruins, but he had never heard of a mother begging for help in this way. Jonas clenched his fists. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man. And he couldn't ignore this. He couldn't walk away from this. The computer beeped, breaking his thoughts. ETA to target. 2 hours, the cold voice of the ship's AI said. Jonas stood up and grabbed his gear. Get ready, he muttered to his crew. We're going in. As the ship hurtled toward the planet, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was different. He wasn't just going to save a family. He was going to do something that could change the course of his life, and perhaps even the course of the galaxy. Back on the planet, Lyra held her children close, her heart racing with hope and fear. Would the human man keep his promise? Would they arrive in time to save them? The minutes seemed to stretch on forever. She had no way of knowing, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be saved. A dangerous journey. Lyra sat in the dim light of her crumbling shelter, her hands trembling as she activated the old battered communicator. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all she had left. The device flickered on, crackling with static. For a moment, she feared it wouldn't work at all. But then, a small green light blinked on the screen, and the transmission began. This is Lyra, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Please, if anyone is out there, I beg you, help me. My children, they are dying. I have nothing left but my life, and I will give it to you, if you will take it. Please, save them. The message was short, but it was everything she had to offer. She closed her eyes as she pressed the button to send the distress signal, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, would hear her cry for help. Thousands of light years away, on a military vessel orbiting a distant planet, Sergeant Alex Carter sat alone in the communications room. His face was tired, worn from years of service. He had seen it all: war, death, loss. But something in the woman's voice stopped him cold. He had been checking routine messages when her distress signal came through, interrupting his monotonous duties. It wasn't the first time he heard a plea for help, but there was something about this one that gripped him. The raw desperation in her voice, the urgency of her words. This was different. Alex wasn't a man who usually let his emotions get the better of him. He had a job to do, and that was it. But as he listened again, something inside him shifted. He couldn't ignore it. He had to go. He stood up, walked over to the control panel, and punched in the coordinates. The planet was on the edge of known space, in a sector that was often ignored. Dangerous, wild, a place where even the bravest of soldiers feared to tread. But Alex was no stranger to danger. He had survived worse. The ship's engines roared to life, and as the vessel accelerated toward the distant planet, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. There was more to this than just a simple rescue mission. Back on the dying planet, Lyra tried to keep herself together. Her children were asleep, their small bodies curled up against her for warmth. She had no idea how long it would take for help to arrive, or if help would even come at all. Every minute felt like a lifetime. But as she sat there, waiting, a strange noise filled the air. A low hum, vibrating through the walls of the shelter. Her heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. Lyra rushed to the door, her breath catching in her throat. She opened it cautiously, peering out into the dark landscape. In the distance, she saw a faint, glowing light in the sky. It was small at first, just a flicker on the horizon. But as she stared, it grew larger, closer. The light took shape, familiar yet alien, and soon Lyra realized it was a ship, descending slowly toward the ground. Her heart raced. Could it be the humans? Could they have heard her plea? The ship landed with a soft thud, kicking up dust and debris. The air was thick with tension. Lyra didn't know what to expect, what kind of people these humans would be, or if they would even be willing to help. But at that moment, all she could do was pray. Inside the ship, Alex Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared for the landing. The control panel showed the planet's atmosphere was unstable, but the ship was sturdy. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The distress signal had been so simple, so direct. but there was a strange unease about the entire situation. He could feel it deep in his gut. The landing gear touched down, and Alex made his way to the airlock. His mind raced. What would he find when he stepped out of the ship? A helpless woman. A trap. He didn't know, but he had made the choice to come, and now he would see it through. The hatch hissed open, and Alex stepped out onto the rocky ground. He adjusted his helmet and surveyed the area. The ruins of a once thriving settlement surrounded him. The silence was deafening. And then, from the shadows, he saw her. Lyra stood there, her figure barely visible in the dim light, holding her children close to her. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She was waiting for him to make the first move. Her face was tired, desperate, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, hope that this stranger could somehow save her family. Alex took a cautious step forward, unsure of what to say. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. He had never done something like this before, rescuing a family from a dying world. But he couldn't ignore the plea for help. Not now. "I'm here," Alex said, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who had faced so many battles. "I'm here to help." Lyra didn't know whether to believe him or not. But at that moment, it didn't matter. She had already given everything she had. And now, all she could do was trust this man. Trust that he would save her children. Trust that he would save them all. But even as she looked into his eyes, the air around them seemed to hum with a strange energy. Something was coming. Something dark. And the danger was far from over. The widow's desperation. Alex Carter stood before the window of the ship's bridge, staring out at the swirling nebula beyond. The stars were dim here, distant, just like the life he once had before becoming a soldier. He thought of home sometimes, his family, his friends, but it felt like another lifetime. A part of him had died in the wars, buried under layers of military armor and hardened resolve. Yet the voice of the woman, Lyra, echoed in his mind, tugging at something deep within him. She had asked for help, but it wasn't just help she had begged for. It was a plea for something more. She had asked him to take her as his wife, to give her children a chance at life. Alex shook his head as if trying to rid himself of the thought, but it clung to him. There was no time for this. He was a soldier. He didn't deal with emotions or relationships. Yet her voice, the way she had spoken, had made it impossible for him to turn away. The decision had been made. He would go to her. Hours later, the hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the cockpit as Alex navigated through the asteroid fields toward the dying planet. The journey was risky. The planet had once been a peaceful place, a part of a thriving galactic alliance. But now, it was a war-torn wasteland. Dangerous factions still roamed, scavenging what was left of the resources. The surface was unpredictable, and no one who came here returned without scars, both physical and emotional. Alex's ship finally descended through the thick clouds, the atmosphere crackling with static. The planet's surface came into view, and he could see the devastation that Lyra had described. Ruined cities, craters from bombings, and abandoned vehicles scattered like broken toys. It was a world that had been drained of its hope. He landed with a thud near a small cluster of dilapidated buildings. As the dust settled, Alex climbed out of the cockpit and looked around, his hand instinctively resting on the pulse rifle slung across his chest. He knew better than to assume the area was completely safe, but there was no turning back now. Lyra and her children were somewhere in this wasteland, and he had come to find them. Inside the shelter, Lyra watched as the small flicker of light from the ship's engines grew dimmer in the distance. Her heart raced. Had he really come? Was he really there? She had tried to hold on to hope, but after so much suffering, it had been difficult to believe anyone would answer her plea. She had feared the loneliness of this place would swallow her whole, just as it had swallowed everyone else who had once lived here. The moment the ship landed, a strange mixture of fear and hope filled her chest. It wasn't just a man coming to rescue her. This was someone from another world, someone who had no reason to care. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew she had to act quickly. Time was running out. Her children were growing weaker by the hour, and she couldn't let them die without a fight. With a deep breath, Lyra stood and moved towards the door. She had no weapons, no defenses, and no place to hide. The ruins around her offered little protection from whatever dangers lay outside. But her resolve was stronger now than ever before. She was determined to do whatever it took to save her children, even if it meant offering herself as something more than just a mother in need. Alex made his way through the broken streets, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of life. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the crunch of his boots on the gravel. As he approached the shelter, he hesitated for a moment, adjusting the strap of his weapon. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get. Would she be grateful? Angry? Desperate? The door creaked open slowly, and Lyra stepped out. Her appearance was striking. Pale skin, dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. But it wasn't her looks that caught his attention. It was the weight in her eyes, the unspoken sadness that filled her gaze. It was the kind of look that came from losing everything, from being at the edge of the world with nothing left to lose. For a long moment, they stood in silence, sizing each other up. Alex could see the fear in her eyes, but there was also a kind of resolve. She wasn't just here to beg for help. She was asking for something far more personal, something more than just a soldier coming to fight for her survival. Finally, Lyra spoke, her voice a soft whisper. "I don't know why you came, but I need you. I need you to take me and my children, to take us away from this place. If you help us, I swear I will be yours, in whatever way you ask." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alex had not expected this. He had come to save them, yes, but had he come for this? For a woman who was willing to offer herself as a price for survival. His heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about something much deeper. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Instead, he nodded slowly. "I'll help you. But we're not staying here. We're getting out of this hellhole." Lyra's eyes flickered with relief and something else, a faint spark of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, but there was something more. In her eyes, there was a deeper plea. She wasn't just asking for help. She was asking for a second chance, a chance to rebuild her life, to rebuild everything that had been taken from her. Alex turned away, motioning for her to follow. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. An unlikely agreement. The air inside Alex's ship was tense and thick with unspoken words. Lyra sat in the corner of the cargo bay, her children huddled close to her. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out the weight of the moment. Alex leaned against a console, arms crossed, watching the small family he had just agreed to help. The children were frail, their clothes tattered, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Lyra, though clearly exhausted, held her head high. She wasn't like the other refugees Alex had encountered in his missions. She wasn't begging or crying. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet determination, like someone who had lost everything but refused to let it destroy her. "I need to know why," Alex said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Why ask me to take you as my wife? There are a lot of ways to survive without making a deal like that." Lyra met his gaze, her expression steady. "Because survival isn't enough," she said simply. "Not for me. Not for my children." Alex raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not just trying to live through this," Lyra replied. "I want to rebuild. I want a life for my children. A real life, not just scraping by in the shadows. And that means I need more than just someone to rescue us. I need someone to stand with us." Her words hit harder than Alex expected. He had been through countless battles, saved countless lives, but no one had ever asked for more than survival from him. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was she being practical, or was there something deeper driving her? "Look," Alex said, running a hand through his hair. "I came to help you because I couldn't ignore your message. But this is something else. I'm not looking for a family, and I sure as hell didn't sign up for marriage." Lyra's expression softened, but she didn't back down. "I know, but you're here now, and you're the only chance we have." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Alex didn't know what to say. He had come here to save lives, not to take on a responsibility this big. But as he looked at her, at the way she held her children like they were her entire world, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was personal. The ship shuddered slightly as it entered orbit. The AI's monotone voice cut through the tension. "Alert! Hostile activity detected in the sector. Recommend immediate departure." Alex cursed under his breath. Of course, it couldn't be that simple. "We've got company," he said, heading to the cockpit. "Stay here." Lyra reached out, grabbing his arm. "Wait. If they find us." "They won't," Alex interrupted, his voice firm. "I've dealt with worse." He left the cargo bay and strapped into the pilot's seat. The radar showed several ships approaching fast. Scavengers, most likely. They had probably picked up on his landing and were looking for an easy target. Alex gritted his teeth. He could handle them, but with Lyra and her kids on board, the stakes were higher than ever. The scavenger ships appeared on the screen, sleek and jagged, like predatory birds. They opened fire without hesitation, and the ship rocked violently as the shields absorbed the impact. "Great," Alex muttered, flipping switches and activating the weapon systems. "You want to fight? Let's dance." The ship's cannons roared to life, firing bursts of energy at the attackers. The scavengers were fast, darting around like mosquitoes, but Alex was faster. He maneuvered the ship with expert precision, taking out one enemy after another. Back in the cargo bay, Lyra held her children tightly as the ship shook. She whispered soothing words to them, but her own fear was hard to hide. She didn't know much about human ships, but she could tell this one wasn't meant for heavy combat. If the scavengers overpowered them, a sudden explosion rattled the ship, and Lyra's heart sank. The door to the cargo bay slid open, and Alex appeared, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. "One of the scavengers latched onto the hull. I need to deal with it manually." "What does that mean?" Lyra asked, her voice shaking. "It means I have to go outside," Alex replied. "And if I don't come back, you'll need to get this ship out of here." Lyra stood, her eyes blazing. "You're not leaving us. Not like this." Alex hesitated, surprised by the fire in her voice. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do," Lyra said. "You can fight for us. Fight with us. But don't make me watch you throw your life away." Her words struck a chord Alex didn't want to admit was there. He nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if this goes south, you get these kids to safety. No matter what." Lyra nodded, and for the first time, Alex saw a hint of trust in her eyes. Outside the ship, Alex suited up and stepped onto the hull, the vacuum of space pressing against him. The scavenger's boarding pod was attached like a leech, its drills digging into the ship's armor. Alex moved quickly, planting explosives on the pod's weak points. He could see the scavengers inside, scrambling to break through. "Not today," Alex muttered, setting the timer and launching himself back toward the airlock. The explosion lit up the darkness, sending debris flying. Alex barely made it inside before the shockwave hit, but the ship held together. He collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily. In the cargo bay, Lyra and her children waited anxiously. When Alex returned, bruised and exhausted but alive, Lyra's relief was palpable. She stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said softly. Alex shrugged, trying to play it off. "Just doing my job." But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wasn't just fighting to protect strangers anymore. He was fighting for something he hadn't even realized he wanted, a purpose beyond war. And as he looked at Lyra and her children, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this unlikely agreement was exactly what he needed. The weight of the promise. The days aboard the ship passed slowly, and the tension between Alex and Lyra simmered, though neither dared to speak of it directly. They had an unspoken understanding. He was helping her, yes, but at a cost. The offer she had made was still hanging in the air, a fragile promise neither of them knew how to handle. Lyra had not spoken much since their conversation. She was preoccupied with her children, keeping them close, feeding them what little they had left, trying to comfort them in this strange new world that was both terrifying and hopeful. Alex could see the toll it was taking on her. She had carried the weight of her family's survival alone for too long, and the burden was beginning to show. Alex, on the other hand, found himself spending long hours navigating the ship's systems, avoiding his own thoughts. He kept telling himself that he had made the right decision. He had to help. It was the only thing he could do. But the thought of marrying her, even for the sake of her children, those innocent, scared eyes, felt wrong. There was no room for anything more. He couldn't let himself be emotionally involved. He had learned long ago that attachment was a weakness in his line of work. One evening, as the ship coasted through the quiet darkness of deep space, Alex found Lyra standing at the window of the observation deck. The stars outside were distant, indifferent, and the silence in the room was almost suffocating. She didn't notice him approach until he spoke. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" His voice was low, uncertain. Lyra turned, her face soft but tired. "About what?" "The promise," Alex said, his eyes locking onto hers. "The one you asked me to make. To take you as my wife." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, Alex thought he saw a flicker of something else there, a sadness, a weariness that only someone who had lost everything could understand. She took a step closer to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking you for a fairy tale, Alex," she said. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking for a chance to give my children something real. You don't have to care for me, but they need a father." Alex felt his chest tighten. He had been expecting anger or desperation, but instead there was something calm in her words, something genuine. "I'm just trying to survive," Lyra continued. "But they deserve better than that. They deserve more than just survival." She took another step closer, her voice trembling slightly. "And Before she could finish, there was a sudden violent shudder through the ship. The lights flickered, the engines roared louder than before, and a deep, rumbling sound shook the walls. "What the hell?" Alex barked, rushing to the controls. He could hear Lyra and her children scrambling behind him. "Enemy ship," the ship's AI blared in his earpiece. "Unauthorized craft detected, engaging weapons." Alex's heart raced. The ship had been flying under radar, trying to avoid detection by any hostile factions, but apparently someone had found them. "Brace for impact," Alex shouted, diving into the pilot's seat. He quickly initiated evasive maneuvers, but it was clear the enemy ship was too close. They were trapped. Lyra grabbed her children, pulling them into the safety of the cargo bay, her eyes wide with fear. She knew what this meant. If they couldn't get away, they would die here, just like everyone else on this forsaken planet. But Alex couldn't allow that to happen. Not after everything. His hands flew over the controls, trying to outmaneuver the enemy ship's fire, but every attempt to break free was met with more incoming blasts. The ship's shields flickered weakly, and he could feel the ship groaning under the stress. "We're not going to make it," he muttered, gritting his teeth. His mind raced for a solution, but there was no time. He was out of options. He had to fight back, but his weapons were limited, and the enemy ship was too powerful. Just then, Lyra appeared beside him, her face pale but determined. "There's another way," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. Alex glanced at her, confused. What do you mean? Lyra reached into a compartment by the cockpit and pulled out a small, unfamiliar device. It was alien technology, sleek and glowing faintly. This will disable their weapons temporarily, but it's dangerous. It might destroy our own ship too. Alex's eyes widened. You trust this thing? I have no choice, Lyra replied, her gaze meeting his. Neither do you. Alex hesitated for only a second before grabbing the device from her. On 3, he said, taking a deep breath. 1, 2, 3. Lyra pressed a button on the device just as Alex slammed his fist into the ship's control panel, diverting all the power to the auxiliary systems. A sharp pulse shot out from the ship, and the enemy vessel's weapons flickered and shut down. The ship's AI immediately announced, "Weapons offline. You are no longer under attack." Alex exhaled sharply, his hands still trembling. They had made it, but they were far from safe. Lyra's eyes softened as she looked at him. You see, sometimes survival takes more than just strength. For the first time since their encounter, Alex truly saw her, not just as a woman in distress, but as someone who had fought to keep her family alive, someone who had never given up. And for the first time, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, survival could be enough to start something new. A moment of truth. Lyra didn't turn when Alex spoke, her gaze still locked on the stars beyond. The silence hung between them, thick with unspoken emotions. She had been thinking about it. The offer, the promise, the impossible decision she had made. In the quiet of space, the loneliness of her situation had never felt more profound. She had asked for a future, but she was afraid that asking him for something so personal might cost them more than they could afford. I didn't mean to make things complicated, she said, her voice softer than Alex had ever heard it. But you're the only one who responded. I thought maybe you could be the answer to all of this. Alex stepped closer, his boots echoing softly on the deck. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, and even that felt distant now, almost irrelevant. He wasn't sure what to say. He had always kept his emotions buried deep inside, locked away like everything else. But something about Lyra's quiet vulnerability was breaking through the walls he had carefully built around himself. I don't know what you expect from me, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm not here to be your savior, Lyra. I'm here because I gave my word. That's all. She nodded, but there was a flicker of something, an understanding, a surrender in her eyes. You think this is about survival, but it's not. It's about hope. The children, they need more than just someone to feed them. They need a future. I need a future. And right now, you're the only one who can give it to us. Alex could see the deep pain behind her words. It wasn't just the loss of her husband or the destruction of her home. Those things were part of it, but they weren't the whole story. There was something else, something deeper. She wasn't just asking him to marry her out of desperation. She was asking for a partner, a protector, a chance to rebuild her life and give her children what they deserved. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated, not knowing how to respond. I'm not the hero you think I am, Lyra. I'm just a soldier. I came here to do a job, not to change everything. Lyra turned then, facing him for the first time with eyes full of quiet determination. Maybe you don't have to be a hero. Maybe you just have to be there, to be someone who doesn't give up. Because that's what I need. That's what they need. Her words were simple, but they hit him hard. The weight of the promise she had asked of him suddenly felt heavier. He had spent years avoiding attachments, pushing away anything that might make him feel something. But now, standing here with Lyra, looking at her children who were so young and fragile, he couldn't help but wonder if this was what he was meant to do. I can't promise anything, Alex said quietly, but I can help you rebuild. I can help you protect your family. That's all I can give right now. Lyra's face softened, a fleeting smile crossing her lips. That's all I need. For the first time in days, Alex allowed himself to feel something other than duty. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. He had made a promise, and whether he was ready or not, he was going to keep it. The ship's engines hummed steadily as they made their way toward the dying planet's orbit. Alex stood by the navigation console, staring at the coordinates that would take them to the surface. He couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. As he glanced at Lyra and her children, now gathered quietly in the corner of the room, he realized that this journey, this strange new beginning, had already changed them all. And the real test was yet to come. A new beginning. The ship's engines hummed steadily as it neared the distant planet, the one where Lyra had once called home, now reduced to a barren wasteland. Alex stood at the helm, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He could feel the weight of the journey coming to an end. His heart beat with an unfamiliar rhythm, something between determination and uncertainty. He had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. Lyra was in the back of the ship with her children, preparing for their arrival. The twins, barely old enough to understand what was happening, clung to her as if the very sight of the human man could break their fragile world. But Lyra had explained it all to them in quiet whispers, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and resignation. They didn't fully grasp the meaning of their mother's request, but they trusted her, as children do. When Alex finally turned to face Lyra, she was standing at the threshold of the cargo bay, her eyes searching his face, waiting. There was a silent question in her gaze, a question Alex still didn't have an answer to, but he had learned to stop avoiding. For weeks, he had tried to keep himself distant, to remind himself that this was nothing more than an arrangement, a duty he had sworn to uphold. But every moment, every word between them had chipped away at the walls around his heart. "You know, you didn't have to ask me to do this," Alex said, his voice low, almost as if testing the words. "I could have just helped you get away. You didn't need to. Make it personal." Lyra's lips curled into a small, tired smile. Sometimes survival is personal. And sometimes hope is all we have left. "I didn't ask for your help to just survive, Alex. I asked because, in you, I saw something more." Alex blinked, his throat tightening. "And what's that?" "Strength," she said softly, stepping forward until they were only a few paces apart. "Not the kind that wins battles or survives wars. The kind that builds something after the fight is over. The kind that can look at a broken world and choose to rebuild it, even when everything tells you it's impossible." Alex exhaled slowly, taking in the weight of her words. He had seen plenty of destruction in his lifetime, but he had never considered what came after: the rebuilding, the healing. He was a soldier, a warrior, trained to fight and protect, not to nurture or restore. But in Lyra's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: a reason to try, to rebuild something meaningful beyond the endless cycles of war. "Maybe I'm not the man you think I am," Alex said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Maybe I don't have the answers, but I'll do what I can. For you, for your children." Lyra's eyes softened, and for a moment, she looked like the woman she used to be before the war, before the destruction of her planet, before all the loss. There was hope in her eyes, real, undeniable hope. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her voice steady, "one step at a time." As the ship descended toward the planet's surface, the once dying world below began to appear more like a canvas. Barren, yes, but with endless potential. There would be challenges, hardships, and sacrifices ahead. But there was also the possibility of something new, something neither of them had dared to dream of in the darkest moments of their lives. The future was uncertain, but as the ship touched down, and the doors opened to a world that had seen so much loss, Alex realized something profound. Survival had always been the goal, but now, for the first time in his life, he had something else to fight for, something worth rebuilding. And maybe, just maybe, This was where it all began.